Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Community Preservation Act information session and priority forum. So the Community Preservation Act, or CPA, is a fantastic opportunity to advance local projects in the realm of historic resources, open space and recreation, and community housing. This is a brand new program for the city of Worcester, and so we're in the very first stages of designing it, and that is why we want to have you all here today, and we're so thankful that you've taken this time out of your afternoon to join us. So we really want to make the most out of this opportunity. So your feedback is so important on how we want to spend these community preservation dollars. So this is the first of 3 community forums that we're going to be hosting this month. We'll have an in-person session tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. at City Hall in the Levi Lincoln Room, as well as a Spanish language forum on December 18th in the Worcester Public Library Banks Room, also at 5:30. So if you know folks who are interested in joining but couldn't make it today, those are some other opportunities. In addition, this forum is being recorded and is going to be posted to the City of Worcester website afterwards, so that folks who are not able to attend any of these sessions will be able to check it out at that time. So in this way, we're trying to make this content as accessible to as many people as possible. Additionally, a lot of the exercises that you're going to participate in today will also be created into online polls and surveys that people will be able to log into and provide their feedback for at a later date as well. So let's get started. My name is Jacqueline Burmeister, and I work for the City of Worcester Executive Office of Economic Development. So I am the Community Preservation Manager. So this is a brand new program, the Community Preservation Program. So I've been working in this capacity for about 4 months now, though I have been working with the city for quite a number of years before this. So I'm not completely new. I'm joined today also by Paul Morano, who is the Assistant Chief Economic Development, of the Special Projects Division in Economic Development. We also have several members of the Community Preservation Committee here. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Community Preservation Committee in a little bit, but for now, they're really interested in hearing from you. They're a bunch of volunteer residents from the community who are going to be working a lot on implementing the community preservation program. So we'll talk more about that in a bit, but they're also eager to hear what you think. So what are the goals today? We have 2 goals for this session. The first goal is to share information on CPA with you. Where does this money come from? Who can apply? And what are the minimum project eligibility requirements from the state? What are the things that are outside of our control that apply to all projects? We know that we are going to get a lot of projects proposed from the community for these funds. And not every project is we're not going to be able to fund every project. So one of the second goals today is to learn about your preferences as the public, your priorities for the projects that you would like to see funded by the Community Preservation Act dollars. And helping us to create the criteria that we're going to be using to rank projects that will ultimately be funded. So the way that it works is that we're going to use these community sessions to identify your priorities. We're going to take those priorities and turn them into goals of the community preservation program, outlining them in the community preservation plan. And using those goals, we're going to create the criteria by which we rank projects that are submitted to the Community Preservation Committee. And those projects that have the highest scores are therefore aligned the most with the goals and the priorities of the community. And so this is why it's so important that we hear from you, because we want to make sure that these projects are absolutely what you're looking for from this opportunity. So the first portion of the presentation is going to be an introduction to the Community Preservation Act. Some of you are very familiar with the presentation with the Community Preservation Act. Some of you might even seen a version of this presentation before. So we're going to go through that just to make sure everyone's on the same page. We're going to talk a little bit about the Community Preservation Committee, which is the committee that is ultimately doing the work of selecting these projects that come to us. And then an overview of the 3 funding categories I mentioned earlier. What is eligible by the state standards of historic resource projects, community housing projects, and open space and recreation projects. After that, we're going to have our first exercise in which we hear from you about what your preferences are about those categories and what percentage of the funding or what amount of funding or priority that we should be putting toward each of those funding categories. After that, we're going to be jumping in a little bit deeper to each of those funding categories in particular. Throughout this process of creating the program, we've spent a lot of time here looking over city documents, having interviews with community groups that work in these categories to really understand what some of the needs are in the community. We want to share those with you and see if you agree that these are the types of things that we want to spend our Community Preservation Act dollars on. You'll have the ability to rank some of the themes that we've discovered throughout our interview process, as well as add your own. So forward, before we begin, does anyone have any questions up to this point? You could raise your hand here, or you can type it into the chat. All right, we will jump right in then. So what is the Community Preservation Act? So the Community Preservation Act is a state law that was established around the year 2000 that allows communities like Worcester to create a community preservation fund. So that fund is a special fund that is only forever to be used for projects that are proposed locally in the realm of historic resources, community housing, or open space and outdoor recreation. This money will never get absorbed into the general fund. It will only be used for these purposes. In 2022, in the municipal election, question 5, the voters of Worcester voted for the Community Preservation Act here, and we are now joining 200 other communities in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in being able to establish this fund. The fund is supplied in part by a surcharge of 1.5% on the annual property tax beginning in fiscal year 24. So that was in the second half of 2023 that we began collecting this surcharge. So this surcharge, it's not 1.5% on top of your percentage of taxes. It is 1.5% of the total of property taxes that are collected after the first $100,000. It applies to residential, commercial, and industrial properties after those first $100,000. So a house that costs $200,000 would only be charged for the second $100,000. Additionally, all exemptions apply when it comes to anything you would have an abatement for having qualifying as a low-income household or a low or medium income senior property owner. So all of those would apply. So when we're looking at what this surcharge actually looks like, an average single family home valued at $371 here in the city of Worcester would be paying about $56 a year for CPA. And that began with the last 2 quarterly bills issued in December of 2023 and March of 2024. And those were separate bills, you might have noticed. We are integrating our tax software so that starting in July of 2025, your bills will all be in the same tax bill that will be covered by the escrow of your mortgage company. It should already be covered by the escrow of your mortgage company, but will all appear on that one bill. So that is one portion of the Community Preservation Fund. The other portion is an annual state match. This is from a trust fund that's divided annually between all the Community Preservation Act communities in the Commonwealth. And the trust fund is made up of fees collected on property transactions at the Registry of Deeds. This year, we received just this past month our first disbursement from the Community Preservation Trust Fund. And we received about $750,000 from the state that we wouldn't have had access to otherwise. So that's pretty exciting. So in addition to that, we could accrue interest on this money, which these days is pretty significant. So our first fiscal year 24, which is recently closed, we collected about $3.6 million. And this was before we received the trust fund distribution. We estimate that in fiscal year 25, which includes that disbursement, we're going to have $4.7 million. So we haven't spent any of this money yet. So this is a really exciting opportunity to begin really funding some of these cool projects. So there are a few restrictions that I'll go over right now about how this money is divided up and the types of projects it could be used on. The first thing is that these are capital projects. We're not able to fund management costs or salaries with this money. Every category requires that you have at least a minimum of 10% of your revenues every year that goes into it. They don't want you to ignore one of these categories. And so we've already allocated 10% of our revenues from fiscal year 24 into open space and recreation, to historic resources, and to community housing. So this money has already been set aside. We have $360,000 in each of these categories. Additionally, we are allowed to have up to 5% for an optional administrative fund. This will cover things that are like due diligence for projects. So land appraisals. It could also be for things like food for public meetings, printings, consultants, administrative salaries for the Community Preservation Act. And then the last 65% of the revenues and the fund can be used for any of those three projects. So theoretically, you could spend up to 75% of your revenue on any of those three categories. So that's really exciting. The other thing that's really exciting is that the Act does not restrict who can apply for these funds. This is going to be a grant program that's open to the community. And so neighborhood groups, nonprofits, individuals, this is definitely, as well as the city itself, there's a lot of possibility for applicants. And so it's a very democratic fund in that sense. The voters voted to have this tax, but the voters are also able to apply for these grants, as well as help decide what those priorities are, which is what we're doing today. So who decides what projects are chosen? So I talked about the Community Preservation Committee briefly already. This is a committee of residents that are in charge of creating the Community Preservation Plan, which outlines those priorities and those criteria. They prepare the CPA application guidelines and review the applications and score them, and ultimately recommend the CPA budget and the projects to City Council. These folks are Worcester residents. There are 4 at-large members, but 5 of the members of this 9-person committee actually come from other boards and commissions. So they're really hardworking folks and have experience in these other boards and commissions. We have someone from the Conservation Commission, the Historical Commission, the Planning Board, the Parks and Recs Commission, and the Worcester Housing Authority Board. The idea is that they're bringing this information and knowledge that they've had working on those boards with them to the Community Preservation Committee. The role of the Community Preservation Manager, myself, is to manage the Community Preservation Program. So I'm the liaison between the committee and the residents. I'm here to provide technical assistance to everyone and help to manage and track CPA funding. So if you're trying to get in touch with someone, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm now going to go over quickly the 3 categories of projects and the types of things that are eligible for each. And at this point, you're going to be able to start weighing in on which of these funding categories is the most important to you. So when it comes to historic resources, the state defines historic resources as a building, structure, vessel, real property, document or artifact that is listed on the Massachusetts State Register of Historic Places, or MACRIS. This is an online portal in which buildings and properties are designated as historic. Or for things that are not buildings or properties, or maybe haven't gotten listed, anything that's determined as locally historical significant by the Historical Commission. And we have a local historic commission that meets, I believe, twice a month to discuss matters that will eventually include CPA funding eligibility. So the types of projects that can be funded under historic resources are acquisition of historic resources, preservation of historic resources, and the rehabilitation and restoration of historic resources. And some examples of each of those would be for acquisition, perhaps Boston acquired a historic stable that was turned into a historical educational site about colonialism back in 2023. In Scituate, they purchased the house of Abraham Lincoln's great-great-great-grandfather to preserve that as a historic resource. A preservation project would be the preservation of the Declaration of Independence in Milford. They had a copy of it there, and they were storing it in a vault that needed an new HVAC system. So they were able to replace that HVAC system, and that was preserving the Declaration of Independence. Another example is the preservation of town records through digitization, which they did in Abington. Rehabilitation and restoration projects include rehabilitation of a historic burial ground in Marshfield. They did gravestone restorations there. And in Springfield, they actually had a restoration of historic homes grant program where owners of historic homes could restore, are able to restore those exteriors of their homes. When it comes to open space and recreation, open space is defined as land to protect future and existing well fields, aquifers, recharge area, watershed land, agricultural land. We're talking about rivers and streams, pond and lake frontage, anything that's protecting scenic vistas, land for wildlife, nature preserves, and land for recreational use. When it comes to outdoor recreation, the definition of that is active or passive recreational use, including but not limited to land for use as community gardens, trails, and non-commercial youth and adult sports, as well as the use of land for parks, playgrounds, and athletic fields. There are a few exceptions here. We are not allowed to fund artificial turf, indoor structures, or stadiums. We are not allowed to build sidewalks in the right of way that is abutting public roads. We could build sidewalks in parks, but the idea is that CPA is supposed to improve upon what is happening in the community, not supplement DPW's budget for resurfacing. And finally, we're not allowed to do anything with dog or horse racing facilities. The types of projects that are eligible for open space and recreation funding include acquisition of land for use as open space and for outdoor recreation, creation of open space for outdoor recreation opportunities, preservation of open space and recreation facilities, and rehabilitation of recreational facilities, as well as open space land that was initially purchased with CPA funds. So some examples of this are of acquisition. In Truro, they acquired beach area to extend Great Hollow Beach. So they made that beach bigger. And in Dartmouth, they acquired 61 acres of open space with hiking trails. For creation, they constructed pickleball courts on municipal land in Southampton, and they constructed trails on existing parcels in Sturbridge. Preservation projects might include something like removal of invasive species at Fitzgerald's Lake in Northampton. So removal of invasive species in some cases can be considered preservation. We'll talk more about that. And then the purchase of an agricultural restriction on 12 acres of land in Deerfield is another example. For rehabilitation, they rehabilitated a local skate park in Tewksbury, and they were able to use CPA funds for design fees for the rehabilitation of a public pool in Weston in 2023. When it comes to community housing, low and moderate income housing for individuals and families, including low or moderate income senior housing is the definition used by the state. And so low income is 80% of the area-wide median income, and moderate is 100% of the area-wide median income. And these are fairly similar to the definitions by HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Federal Department. A senior is persons who have reached the age of 60 or over. And there are a lot of different types of projects that qualify for community housing funds. You could acquire land or buildings for the use for community housing. You could create community housing, preserve community housing, or support community housing pre-development activities. Finally, you could rehabilitate or restore community housing as long as it was initially purchased with CPA funds. So some examples of community housing acquisition are the purchase of a building to turn into community housing, which is what they did in Cambridge for $7.9 million in 2022. Or you could even have a down payment assistance program that is an example of acquiring community housing. For helping folks to acquire community housing. Construction of a deed-restricted affordable unit with Habitat for Humanity in Amherst, that's an example of creating community housing. Or the transfer of funds to the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust. Here in Worcester, we have a Municipal Housing Trust Fund, which helps to develop new affordable housing here in Worcester. And CPA funds can be transferred directly to the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust Fund for them to manage and do what they do best. Preservation. Projects include window replacements in apartment complexes that are community housing, or the replacement of external entry doors, which is what they did in a Housing Authority building in Arlington in 2021. And support activities include engineering fees for new community housing in Great Barrington, or preliminary design work to obtain zoning relief for community housing in Needham. So that's all a lot, and I recognize that was a lot of information at once, but I really want to give you a flavor for the diversity of the different projects that are eligible under each of these categories, to try and help to understand better the different types of projects that are eligible in an easy, straightforward way. They have created a matrix in which verbs along the side, basically what you can do with that money. We talked about acquisition, creation, preservation, and whatnot. And so this is a really handy way to quickly determine if a project is eligible. And unfortunately, these eligibility requirements are not something that we could change here in Worcester, but there's something to keep in mind as you think about the types of projects you want to prioritize. Now we're going to jump into the priorities for each of these funding categories. So this part is really exciting. So the first few months, a lot of time going over some of the existing documents that live in the city as far as these different funding categories. A lot of these documents, master plans, have been created with a lot of public input already. And so I was really looking for some guidance on what is already out there. What are people already thinking about the themes in each of these funding categories? So in addition to reviewing those plans, I set up a bunch of interviews with community groups throughout the city that are doing the work in these different funding categories: open space and recreation groups, community housing groups, historic resource preservation groups, to see if it lines up with what I was reading in these existing plans. Between all of that, I was able to tease out a few themes that kept on recurring and seemed to echo a lot of what they were seeing as the needs in the community. And those are what I'm going to be sharing with you next. I'm going to share those with you, and then you're going to have a chance to tell us what you think about those, as well as put in some of your own thoughts on what those priorities should ultimately be for funding each of those categories. So this is that last portion, that feedback from the public. So we're going to start with historic resources. And in this case, I was looking at a few different documents in the city, including the Worcester Now Next long-term plan, which had sections on the just our history and our culture. We had our Becoming Worcester cultural plan, which reflects on some of the historical context of our city. We have our design review guidelines, which are basically looking at the different types of architecture that exist throughout the time that Worcester has existed, the Worcester Historic Preservation Study, as well as the Worcester Demolition Delay Ordinance. So these are some of the documents that I was looking toward, many of which were created community input. In addition to that, I got to interview a bunch of community groups throughout the city of Worcester, including the Crown Hill Neighborhood Coalition, Preservation Worcester, the Worcester Historical Museum, the Worcester Black History Project, the American Antiquarian Society, and the Worcester Historical Commission and staff, as well as the clerk's office. And so between all of that, a few themes emerged, and these are just things that some folks in the city from these plans and from these interviews think should be priorities when it comes to how we spend our money in the historic resource category. And so again, after you hear these, you'll have an opportunity to weigh in on your own and then tell us if you have additional priorities. So the first theme that emerged in talking to these groups, and this happened in almost every single group, was this idea that CPA funds should be used and prioritized on projects that are preserving underrepresented stories. And so this is the idea that Worcester is a community of many diverse populations, but not all of them have been equally represented in historic preservation efforts to date. So some believe that historic research projects and programs that document, preserve, and celebrate underrepresented histories should be prioritized amongst historic preservation projects with CPA funding. The second theme that emerged has to do with historic properties that don't generate income. So there are properties out there that generate income that are historic that can qualify for tax credits. But when it comes to non-income generating properties, they are required to maintain the outside of their house or the building to a historic standard. And if they're facing economic hardship, this could be a lot harder to achieve. And so there were two groups that folks that I interviewed said that we should be really focusing on when it comes to maintaining these historic buildings with folks facing economic hardship. One is owner-occupied homes, especially those in our local historic districts, which once again, under the historical commission, are being asked to maintain their houses to preserve the historic facade, as well as churches. Many churches here in the city of Worcester are located in historic buildings, and as non-income generating properties, they might not have the funds to keep their building maintained. So these are two groups that you'll be able to weigh in on, and if you think this is a priority for how we spend our historic resources CPA funds. Another theme that emerged was the digitization and archiving of historic records. So here in Worcester, there are local records of import that are being stored all over the city, like in people's basements from maybe the minutes of local organizational boards from many years back. And they're just sitting in someone's basement, or at City Hall, we have those official city documents that are in paper form. This idea that we should be digitizing and creating databases that everyone can access of these historic materials. So some folks believe that projects that make accessible historic documents should be prioritized when it comes to CPA funding. So theme 4 was protecting historic buildings that are in danger of demolition. And so unfortunately here in Worcester, a lot of historic properties, some of which go into disrepair to a point of needing to be demolished, or being demolished is the path forward that an owner wants to take. So some folks believe that projects presented to the Community Preservation Committee that are for acquiring these properties and restoring them to those historic standards should be a priority with what we do with our CPA funds. Another theme 5, is advancing the city's sustainability goals and or promoting adaptive reuse or deconstruction. So these are projects that are in part So the idea that older buildings tend to be less insulated and use more energy to heat and cool them. A lot of times the greenest option for preserving and rehabilitating is preserving and rehabilitating a historic building rather than demolishing it and using all new materials to build another one. Adaptive reuse is referring to the repurposing of historic facades into a new construction and preserving that history rather than just building a brand new project. And so some folks believe that projects that help us to achieve our sustainability goals, reducing waste, and using adaptive reuse should be prioritized. And then finally, a lot of folks believe that prioritizing historic research projects or programs that qualify for other CPA funding categories should be prioritized. This idea that if you have a historic resource project that is also creating community housing or is also creating open space and recreation opportunities, that project should score more points because there's more benefit across those different categories. So with that, we are moving into open space and recreation priorities. So as part of the background information collection, I reviewed several plans throughout the city of Worcester. The Now Next plan, again, our long range plan, which is really a nice compilation of a lot of the planning processes that have been done over the last few decades. Our open space and recreation plan, which is updated every 7 years with a lot of community input. We have public park master plans for many of the parks in our city, not all of them, but these are planning processes that are undergone with many folks throughout the city or throughout the neighborhood that a park is located in. We have a Green Worcester plan, which is hoping to make the city more sustainable and climate resilient. We have a mobility action plan, which is still in draft form, but did look over that draft, and our lakes and ponds water quality reports, of course. So we had quite a few interviews that occurred with community groups that work in open space and recreation to really understand some of the needs that the city is facing, and some of the themes that emerged are as follows. So the first theme is expanding green networks and creating wildlife corridors. And so this theme is really about the idea that the per acre value of open space increases as that parcel gets bigger. And so bigger parcels or small parcels that are connected and expand on existing open space parcels are actually providing a bigger bang for your buck. And so some believe that open space projects that abut and therefore expand existing protected open space should be prioritized over detached and separated ones. Another theme that came up was protecting drinking water resources. So the city of Worcester has a series of reservoirs that are actually located outside of Worcester, and protecting the land around those water bodies is more cost effective than removing contaminants that have entered through a water filtration plant. And so the idea is that projects that are about land acquisition that are meant to protect our drinking water supply should be prioritized. The third theme that emerged was creating and enhancing equitable access to open space, especially water. And so Worcester has a lot of public green and blue spaces compared to a lot of cities of its size, but these spaces are generally underutilized. And a lot of that has to do with a lack of awareness and accessible amenities. So physical amenities that are allowing all people to use them. So some believe that projects and programs to make open space and parks more accessible should be prioritized. Theme 4 is advancing projects that are specified in parks master plans. So as I mentioned earlier, master plans are documents that are created with community input. They've also been approved by the Parks Department, which in the case of parks, those are the folks that are going to be maintaining those properties. So there are some folks that believe that projects that advance open or parks master plans should be prioritized. So CPA funds should be prioritized towards master plan projects. Theme 5 is expanding access to fresh and locally grown foods. So there are areas in Worcester that are food insecure, which means that they lack access to fresh and healthy produce. And this, of course, leads to decreased health outcomes for residents in those areas. So formal community gardens and farmers markets are ways to increase access to healthy food in an equitable way. Gardens build community, and our classroom for science and life skills. So some believe that projects that are creating opportunities for gardens and farmers markets and expanding access to fresh and locally grown food should be prioritized. Another theme that emerged was supporting native species and growing the urban forests. So the urban forests and native species provide different ecosystem services such as flood reduction, carbon sequestration, lower air temperatures, as well as neighborhood beautification and increased biodiversity. So there are a lot of reasons why our urban forests and native species are at risk, including invasive species and land management practices. So some believe that projects that support and grow Worcester's native plant and tree species should be prioritized. Another goal or another theme is achieving the city's sustainability and climate resilience goals. So the city is expected to continue to feel increased effects of climate change, including more extreme storms, flooding, and heat. So if there's an open space and recreation project that increases climate resiliency or is created with more sustainable materials, some folks believe that those projects should be prioritized. Theme 8 is supporting the work of dedicated park and open space community groups. And so many of you probably know that there are many parks and open spaces in our community that are maintained not by the Parks Department, but by small nonprofit or even unregistered neighborhood groups. So these friends of groups in part represent the community's opinion on what investments should be made into properties and generally have high impact and low cost projects. So some believe that these are the types of projects that should be prioritized from dedicated park and open space community groups when we're choosing between these types of projects. Theme 9 is investing in sustainable trails, and this came up quite a bit as well. So the city of Worcester has tens of miles of trails, maybe more than tens of miles of trails that crisscross it. And a lot of them are not maintained by the city, but by these dedicated groups. So prolonged use and increased erosion because of climate change have caused trails to need significant upgrades, preferably with higher quality materials that will last longer. So some believe that trail projects that use sustainable materials should be prioritized with community preservation funds. Another theme, theme 10, creating and enhancing alternative mobility options. So this has to do with the idea that currently Worcester, I think we all agree, is a pretty car-centric city and has insufficient infrastructure for other forms of mobility, such as walking, cycling, or micromobility. So this idea is that if you can do projects in parks or even create new parks that increase micromobility or alternative mobility options, these are the types of projects we want to prioritize. So an example of this might be a linear park that has a walking or a biking path in it. Theme 11 is creating and improving access to parks and nature in environmental justice communities. And so EJ communities face greater risk of environmental hazards due to a combination of factors, and parks and nature play a crucial role in enhancing the well-being and quality of life in these communities. And so there are many folks that believe that projects in environmental justice communities should be prioritized, all things considered. And finally, theme 12 is prioritizing open space and recreation projects or programs that qualify for other CPA funding categories. And so this is definitely a theme. Some folks believe that these projects that are both open space and recreation, and as well as some of those other funding categories, historic resources or community housing should be prioritized over other projects because they're bringing more value to those CPA funds. So we are going to move into our final category, community housing. So as part of this process, I was looking at several documents in the city, including the Now Next plan, the analysis of. Hi, folks, I apologize. It looks like I got frozen for a second, but I am back. I apologize about that. Let me bring up that final section for you. Thank you for your patience. All right. So we also have, we're in the process now, and some of you might have been there. We have a housing production plan that is currently being developed, which is a really exciting opportunity to study what our housing needs are here in Worcester. And obviously, we're watching that very closely, and they're in the process of doing their public meetings as well these last few months. So we have a housing strategy as well as an inclusionary zoning ordinance that was recently passed. So these are some of the documents and ordinances that were reviewed. Additionally, we had interviews with community groups throughout the city. A lot of the groups that have been highly active in working on some of these issues, and these are some of the themes that emerged out of those conversations. So the first theme was increasing rates of home ownership. And so home ownership benefits include increased personal financial security, building equity, neighborhood stabilization, increased strength in communities. Right now, rents are rising, and therefore a lot of folks are not able to make that jump into home ownership. Additionally, a lot of the deed restricted there's a lot more affordable rental housing than there are deed restricted home ownership opportunities. And so a lot of folks believe that projects and programs that are going to increase the rates of home ownership and community affordable home ownership should be prioritized. So the second theme was supporting more rental assistance programs. And so rental assistance programs are things like helping to cover the first and last month's rent, supplement rent payments in the case of unforeseen circumstances that might lead to non-payment. These programs can be more cost effective than supporting individuals or families who become unhoused, and of course lead to better social and health outcomes. So some folks believe that rental assistance programs should be the projects that are prioritized amongst community housing projects for CPA. Theme number 3 was providing housing for the unhoused population. So unhoused folks are some of the most vulnerable people in the city. We have very limited shelter space, and permanent housing can take a really long time to secure. So projects and programs that provide housing to the unhoused population is a priority theme amongst some of the interviews that I had. Another theme that came up was creating more accessible housing. And so this is an increasing demand in the city of Worcester for accessible and as well as age in place units for individuals with disabilities and senior populations. So there is a shortage of these units, and a lot of folks believe that creating more accessible housing in the community housing category should be one of the priorities. Theme 5 is supporting higher environmental standards and achieving the city's sustainability and resilience goals. And once again, these buildings are one of the major contributors to climate change. So asphalt and roofs, they also exacerbate flooding and heat island effects in neighborhoods. So there are certifications and best practices for building and landscape design that are going to reduce emissions in those buildings and help to alleviate some of the local flooding and heat island effects that we're feeling so much here in Worcester. So some folks believe that supporting higher environmental standards and achieving the city's sustainability and resilience goals should be one of the priorities of using CPA funds. So we have a few themes here that have multiple parts, much like that one in historical resources did, and this is one of the first ones. So supporting deeper housing affordability. So this has to do with serving households earning below identified area median income. The Community Preservation Act allows you to support community housing up to 100% of the area median income. And this is a chart kind of describing what the area median income is according to HUD and the different household size. And so a lot of communities, some communities go up to 100% AMI, but some communities choose to have different AMIs that are covered by the Community Preservation Act. And so some of the themes that came up talking to different groups around the city was theme 6A was prioritizing projects and programs that serve households that go up to 60%, not necessarily 100%. So these are residents who are likely working part or full time, but struggling to find housing with a rent or mortgage they can afford, or an emergency away from missing their rent payment. So these developments, they're more challenging to create than market rate developments, but it is with the right combination of subsidies more feasible than developing, for example, 30% AMI housing. But 6B is providing housing opportunities for households up to 30% AMI. So these residents in this housing income band are some of the city's most vulnerable populations. So creating housing at 30% AMI and below requires very large subsidies and a commitment to ongoing services. And there's a larger shortage of units in Worcester in this category than compared to any other AMI category. Theme 7 has to do with housing development. So this is the development of new community housing projects. And so talking to folks around the city, there were different ideas about what the priorities should be when we're evaluating new housing developments. And here are a few that came up. Theme 7A is increasing the number of residents served. So this is, we want to prefer bigger projects with more units of housing that serve more individuals and families. These developers are generally experienced, build quickly, and require less oversight by the city administration. They're more expensive, and they tend to have access to other funding sources. CPA would not be covering these entire projects. There's not enough money in CPA to do that, but we would be contributing to a portion of that. 7B is providing opportunities to emerging developers. So emerging developers refer to smaller developers. So those who have had not more than 3 affordable housing developments that they've created. These projects tend to be smaller and to take longer to complete. There's just less financial backing that these emerging developers have, or financing that these emerging developers have access to. So there may be an increased personal investment into the property and the well-being of the tenants because there's fewer people and just it's a smaller project. Theme 7C is advancing shovel-ready projects. So CPA allows you to cover pre-development activities, feasibility studies, engineering and design plans. However, there are some folks that believe that CPA funds should be used for projects that are already ready to construct. So these are projects that we already know they're most likely to be constructed, and they're going to be constructed very quickly because it's only construction that's left. Theme 7D was increasing infill and adaptive reuse development. So this is referring to housing constructed on vacant or underutilized land within an existing developed area. So this has maybe the ADUs, accessory dwelling units you've heard of. So this would be an example of infill development. So adaptive reuse refers to the process of reusing an existing building for a purpose other than which it was originally built or designed for. 7E, supporting developers who have demonstrated they will keep their units affordable after deed restrictions expire. So deed restrictions are requirements that are written into a deed that the rent or that the sale price of a property cannot exceed those affordability bands. And so those usually last for up to 30 years. Some developers or some owners will go back to market rate after those end. There was a feeling that projects that are proposed by developers who have shown that they're not going to go back to market rate after their deed restrictions and have demonstrated that they're going to keep the units affordable should be prioritized. Theme 7F is creating open space and recreational facilities for children and families. And so this is something where, you know, we are creating those amenities for folks that are living in the developments that are going to increase quality of life and access to open space. So next, we had a lot of passion from different groups for serving different populations. So prioritizing programs and projects that serve different populations throughout the city. And so there are quite a few of these. There's a lot of information in your packet. Well, not a lot. There's some information on your packet as well to go into more detail on these. But theme 8A is seniors. We have an aging population in Worcester, so some folks believe that we need to focus on projects that address the needs of seniors. People with disabilities, we want to make sure that there's housing that is specifically designed for folks with disabilities. Theme 8C is young parents. So young parents are generally early in their careers and have more limited economic resources, as well as more space needs, having families. And then families in general was considered a theme, have more individuals, require more space. And currently there are fewer 3 and 4 bedroom affordable units compared to other family-sized units. Youth who experience housing insecurity or homelessness are more likely to have insecure housing later on. And I'm just noticing that there might be some in the chat. Oh, no. Okay. And then 8F is immigrants, especially refugees. They may have a more difficult time finding housing due to language and cultural barriers and may be more likely to have a lower income. 8G is longtime residents of redline neighborhoods. So systemic racism and redlining practices have had negative economic consequences. Worcester's historically redline areas do have fewer homeownership opportunities to this day. Unhoused couples. So a lot of shelters for individuals are not big enough to accommodate domestic partners. And so that's something that would be addressed if this were a priority. Single women face unique challenges and may benefit from having a space, specific services or programs. And then persons struggling with addiction. So people dealing with drug addiction are a particularly vulnerable population and may have more challenges finding housing. So this is just a list of the different populations of folks that people thought if there was a project that specifically targeted these populations, that project should be prioritized. The next theme is about supporting local landlords of non-deed restricted properties. So these are landlords of what's called naturally occurring affordable housing. And so these are folks who own maybe a 3-decker and they really love their tenants, so they're not going to raise the rent to market rate. They keep it low, but as a consequence, maybe don't have the same economic means to make the repairs that they could if they charge market rate. And so this idea in theme 9A is incentivizing landlords to maintain affordable housing by providing a program or a subsidy that would, in exchange for a deed restriction, that locks in that affordability longer term. Theme 9B is supporting landlords that rent to the homeless population. So there are some programs that support landlords that choose to rent to individuals and families that are experiencing homelessness, but more incentives may help to create more options. And then finally, prioritizing community housing projects or programs that qualify for other CPA funding categories. And so much like those in the other categories, there were folks that believe that maybe a community housing project that was also a historic project should be elevated in points because you're addressing more of the funding categories. I'm going to wrap up our presentation by telling you what the next steps are for the community preservation plan. So our next steps. So this December, we are collecting all this community input at these public forums. We are also going to be launching a version of this poll that has a little bit more detail on all of these categories for the general public. We're going to be trying to get that into several languages so that everyone could more people could participate. They'll be able to reference this online presentation as well. So we'll be collecting that input throughout December, as well as through January. We're going to incorporate all this feedback and bring it before the Community Preservation Committee in January. And we are going to ultimately decide on what the goals of the community preservation plan are. So we're going to draft that community preservation plan in January and publish that draft on the City of Worcester website. So that will be an opportunity to see what the priorities and the goals and the criteria are going to be for projects when we eventually open that funding application. There's going to be a comment period and then a hearing in front of the Community Preservation Committee come February. That will be kind of the final opportunity for the public to weigh in on what things look like. We'll take those final comments, and hopefully at that point, it won't be too much that needs to be changed. If we incorporate the feedback right now, that is, and then hopefully in early spring of 2025, we'll be able to publish that final draft of the community preservation plan and the application, and open the application and advertise it to folks so that they can begin to submit their projects. While the goal is to make a fairly straightforward and easy application process, we know that this might not be something that everyone has done before. So we're going to hold public workshops in which, if you have an idea for what you want to do with Community Preservation Act funds, you can come and kind of develop that idea with us using these funding eligibility criteria, and learn the process of submitting an application. After application period closes, there will be review by the Community Preservation Committee. And we're hoping that by summer of next year, we'll have the first round of funding allocated. So that's kind of where we're at as far as our timeline. Thank you so much for being in part. This is probably one of the most important parts of the process, having your input. If you're interested in staying abreast of everything that is going on and all of these different milestones, you can join our mailing list. On that mailing list, you'll see drafts of the community preservation plan, opportunities to provide feedback at the public hearing. You'll find the application process, as well as when we ultimately have project updates, those will be included as well. So you could either use that QR code or you could sign up using the hyperlink. Some other resources for you. We have a webpage, Community Preservation Program, so worcesterma.gov/CPP. As well as our boards and commissions webpage, where you could get information on when the Community Preservation Committee is meeting. Finally, the Community Preservation Coalition is a state nonprofit that provides technical assistance to the community preservation communities. So you could go on there to answer FAQs or to get inspiration for projects that have been successful in other communities. It's a really exciting webpage. They've been around for a long time, since the Community Preservation Program or Act began in the year 2000. So finally, this is my contact. If you have any follow-up questions or concerns, I will try to get this presentation to you in the next few days. But I really just wanted to thank you so much. Like, this is really, like I said before, this is supposed to be a really democratic process. We voted to pay these extra taxes. We want to make sure that we're spending them in a way that aligns with your priorities. So it's really valuable to have you here. Thank you again for providing that input. And if you know anyone who's interested, we have our in-person event tomorrow night at City Hall at 5:30. We're going to have some exciting catering from Sabrosa, Venezuela. So it's incentive, right? We'll also have a Spanish language program the week after on Wednesday, the 18th at the Worcester Public Library. So thank you so much, everyone. Hope that you enjoyed the presentation, found it useful, and thank you so much again for your input. Have a great afternoon.